Welcome to the Wise About Wildfire webinar hosted by the Utah Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. We are excited to have all of you with us today. I'm Taylor Mosman, a Wildland-Urban Interface Specialist, or a WUI Specialist, in Central Utah. This will be the last webinar for this spring 2023 series, so I want to share a big thank you to everyone who has participated in the past several weeks. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be put on Forestry, Fire, and State Lands YouTube channel. If you do not wish to have your voice or image recorded, please do not speak and turn off your camera during the call. Please keep yourself muted until the presentation is over. Feel free to use the raise your hand function. It's that little hand-shaped icon down at the center of your screen, or use the chat box to submit any questions. So to get us started today, please welcome Teirnan Doyle.
Hi, thanks so much, Taylor, and really excited to be here with you all. I see some actually familiar names, which is really great to have in a place, and I'm very honored to be invited to talk to you today about fire-adapted communities. So as I said, my name is Teirnan Doyle. I am the Member Services Coordinator for the Fire-Adapted Communities Learning Network, and we are a peer learning network. I will get into some more specifics about the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network in just a couple of minutes. But I do want to flag for you that I am going to be using the acronym FAC a lot, and we refer to the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network as FACnet. So if I will try to limit my acronym usage to those two. I know it can get quite an alphabet soup going, especially with emergency response and different agencies involved. So I will try to limit that. If at any time anything is confusing, or if you have any questions, please do let me know. And if my screen suddenly disappears, or you can't hear me, or can't see my slides, please let me know that as well. And with all of that said, I will go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about the Fire Adapted Communities Framework, or FAC framework, and I'm going to share some examples of how communities across the United States are working to improve their fire resilience in their specific communities. And so I wanted to start with just talking a little bit about what we mean, what we actually mean when we say fire adapted communities. And you may all be familiar with this already, so bear with me if I'm repeating what you already know. But I do get this question a lot: what is fire adapted communities? What does that actually mean? What do you do? And so one of the things that I wanted to convey today is really that fire adapted communities is a mindset and a practice for building community wildfire resilience in place. And as we go through this talk tonight, I'm going to touch briefly on the background of where that term came from, kind of unpack the nuts and bolts of who participates in fire adaptation, and why it's so critical that everyone in the community is involved in living better with fire. So as I said, fire adapted communities is a practice, a framework for discussing, acting, and thinking about how we live better with wildland fire. And a fire-adapted community is a community that understands its risk, takes action before, during, and after to be more resilient, after a fire to be more resilient. So essentially, the things that you do to lessen the impact of wildfire make you more fire-adapted. So if you take nothing else away from tonight's conversation, I'll hope that you will take away that being fire adapted is a lifelong process, and it requires all of us to really step up to the plate to ensure that our communities do have that resilience and that adaptive capacity within all of us. So the term fire adapted communities is a very specific one, and one that comes out of this national cohesive wildland fire management strategy. And this is a national strategy that I'm sure other speakers in this series have talked about, but I did want to bring it up for fire adapted communities as well. So this strategy combined efforts of the Department of Interior and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to align a lot of this federally funded fire work into three pillars. So the safe, effective, risk-based wildfire response, resilient landscapes, and the third one, fire-adapted communities. So under this strategy, fire-adapted communities means that human populations and infrastructure are as prepared as possible to receive, respond to, and recover from wildland fire. And so as promised, I'm talking a little bit more about FACnet. I work for the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, and we're one of kind of the upholders of this FAC pillar for the National Cohesive Strategy. And our main goal is to help communities live better with fire in their own local contexts. So we do this by helping people who are working on fire adaptation to learn from one another, share lessons and successes, and help build programs that will make their communities more resilient to wildfire. So you can see a little bit more about how FACnet is funded there. We are part of this unique partnership among the Watershed Research and Training Center, the Nature Conservancy, the Forest Service, and the Department of Interior, as well as some private funders and the many wildfire resilience practitioners that make up our membership. And FACnet is part of the Fire Networks, which is a kind of suite of member-based or member-focused networks that help communities and people kind of learn all of the different skills and knowledge bases and develop programs and practices on everything from prescribed burning to community outreach and engagement. And as I said, we're a steward of that third tenet of the National Cohesive Strategy. So in our network, we have over 400 community, organizational, and government leaders who are really working on making sure that their communities are learning to live well with fire. And so one of the things that we think about a lot is just how different all of those communities are among this network, all of those amazing people who are working on fire adaptation. Do you think that all of those 400 communities will look, act, and govern in exactly the same ecosystems? They really, of course, do not. And so what this means when we talk about fire adapted communities is that FAC work is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's not a checklist or even a specific set of actions that communities have to take. It really is that more framework-based work. And the reason that it is not a checklist is that our communities are also different. There are different sizes, there are different economic drivers that impact them. They have different political environments, building codes, all of that wonderful stuff that goes into building a community is just differs so wildly from place to place. And so working on fire adaptation from this kind of more framework mindset means that all of these very different communities can take the ideas and concepts from the framework that work best for them and adapt them to meet their local needs. So the bad news about this is that FAC is not an endpoint. It isn't some place that you reach, some pinnacle you reach when you have done all of the magical right things. Fire adaptation really is a constant process that requires all of us. And the decisions and actions that each community undertakes to make that community more adapted to wildfire, all of those actions are going to differ a lot from community to community. But on the other hand, the flexibility of this framework approach means that we're better able to adapt actions to the changing conditions of communities. So as I'm sure you're all familiar with, there's basically a constant change in communities. The political environment changes, the ecosystem changes, even the people that live in our communities change. And so this means that our work to create fire adapted communities will never be complete. It's something that we need to steward over time and that we need to nurture and be willing to be adaptive in order to meet the needs of those changing conditions within our communities. So to summarize, what do we mean when we say fire adapted communities? It's really about taking this framework approach to our work so that it can be effective and adaptable to the needs of local communities, to these complex environments in which we work and those changing conditions that we all experience. And it's really your local context that matters the most. You all, as community practitioners, know your communities the best. So I want to underscore that building a fire adapted community isn't about someone from the outside telling you what to do. It's not about us or the National Cohesive Strategy coming in to say, okay, you've met this threshold or this bar, but it's really helping you think about who and how to engage people in your communities, what partners are at your table and the suite of potential actions and programs that you can bring to meet the needs of your place. So community members are absolutely critical to sharing knowledge, taking action, and shifting mindsets about how to live well with fire in their communities. So I want to move on to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of this framework and kind of what fire different components and actions under the FAC framework look like. So it's all well and good to say it's this flexible approach, but I do want to address, who is involved in fire adaptation, what do fire adapted communities look like, and what type of actions increase fire adaptation, and when do those actions take place. So you'll see on your screen, hopefully, you'll see on your screen, there's this red, teal, and green circle, and we talk about this as the Fire Adapted Communities Wheel or the FAC Wheel. This graphic was designed by members of our network and staff at the network to help describe and articulate the components of this fire adaptation framework in order to kind of help bucket and categorize some of the work that they've been doing in their communities that have really helped them on their pathways and journeys to improve resilience. And one of the purposes of creating this graphic is to make it easier for fire adaptation practitioners and community members to talk to one another about fire adaptation and describe the projects that they are working on. And I do have a couple of disclaimers here. This graphic is not in any way meant to depict all of the possibilities for fire adaptation work. It's more suggestive and more kind of just to help condense things. And as I'll talk about in a minute, some of these actions and activities kind of cut across these different buckets that they've been divided into. So it really is not a linear approach or, again, that kind of checklist idea. But I do want to also underscore that because community context matters so much, and we do have different conditions across communities working on wildfire resilience, that some of these actions and programs will resonate with some communities and not with others. And so that's one reason for creating these buckets. The kind of teal inner ring is just so that it's easier for people to think about the different components of work that they might want to undertake, and then really be able to select those pieces that do work best for their own communities. And that local adaptation and fit are really critical for the success of any of these actions that you might find under this fire adaptation framework. And I also want to note that the purpose of this graphic is really not to hand it out to all of your partners and say, well, who's going to work on the fuel breaks, and who's going to work on prescribed fire, and who's going to work on thinning, and kind of kick down this list, thinking that each of the activities described here has to be implemented in your place. Really, the most important thing that you can do with your partners in your community is to think about what challenges you're facing and what assets you have, and create a plan to help yourself move forward on the things that are really most relevant and most resonant with your community at that time. And then working from this framework, you have the opportunity to kind of revisit and consider again what the needs of your community members are as their context might change. So I did reference kind of the buckets. So this, just to parse out this graphic a little bit more and help you, if you are interested in using this, just help you think about how you might use it both for your own thinking and with your partners. So this inner circle that's on your screen now, this teal slices on the wheel. This shows what these larger kind of categories of work are. So you'll see that these are quite diverse, as I've mentioned, everything from prevention, safety and evacuation, to resident mitigation and partnerships and community engagement. So there's really a wide variety of activities that occur and go into fire adaptation work. And this is just an attempt to kind of, again, create those larger categories so that you can talk to partners and have a bit more of a planning tool to think about what what areas you're moving forward in, and also to help you identify where you might not be working and where you might want to work in the future. So on this outer ring, you'll see that these have more specific activities that fit within these larger categories. And so this is, again, something that's important to think about within your local context, which of these activities, since there are many that fit into one bucket, what are the types of activities that are going to work best for your community and be able to help you advance your fire adaptation goals and increase your community resilience? So just again, what's important to work on will change as your communities change. So if you've just had a recent wildfire, then the recovery bucket may become a way more important piece of your work than it had been in the past. I was at a conference earlier today talking about post-fire and had some organizations discussing about how disruptive it was to have to suddenly shift from watershed restoration to working on post-fire and scrambling to meet the needs of private landowners who had just lost everything on their landscapes and try to reestablish priorities for work. So understanding that all of these categories are really relevant to building resilience is critical and can also hopefully provide a bit of a spark of hope in order to recognize that when you are forced to shift your work, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are no longer working on becoming more fire adapted or more resilient, but rather that your priorities in that moment have to change and that you can continue to build out partnerships and relationships that will help you with all of your fire adaptation work. So to go back to this full wheel here, I did just want to highlight some of these different tracks that we have. So thinking about some entry points that people have into fire adaptation work, resident mitigation is a very common one that we see people starting out doing kind of mitigation around their own home. If they've seen a risk map or if they've been talking to neighbors about about different fuels or maybe recent wildfires. This resident mitigation bucket has been one entry point that we see quite commonly for people coming into fire adaptation work. And you'll see that there are a number of different programs that are related to resident mitigation. So Firewise USA, defensible space work, home or structure hardening work, and then wildfire prep week is another common messaging point where people get to learn more about wildfire and get engaged in action around becoming more fire adapted. So we see a lot of people using the Firewise program to become more involved in fire adaptation work, and that's been really a great entry point for a lot of communities into this fire adapted communities work. And we see that since they do have a checklist, which is so fun to have and really great to be able to describe specific actions to people. It is often a kind of common sense and really great way for people to get involved in fire adaptation work. And then people can use this graphic and this idea of fire adaptation at this larger scale as an umbrella for continuing and building on that Firewise work, so that maybe you start with a Firewise neighborhood and then you move on to partnerships and community engagement. You build a neighborhood ambassador program, which we also have tools to do, and some great information on building out neighborhood ambassador programs, which I'd be happy to share with you if anyone is interested. So that Firewise can lead into neighborhood ambassador program, and then neighborhood ambassadors might start recruiting more Firewise programs, and which could lead into fuel breaks around neighborhoods. So all of these actions can kind of build on one another. You might start with one specific program and then recognize how these different pieces can kind of fit together and continue to increase and build on one another to really create this larger picture and work of fire adaptation and fire adapted communities. And similarly, you might be working on safety and evacuation. And how you choose to work on safety and evacuation might differ a lot depending on the type of community that you're in, what your roads are like, whether you have that one point of ingress or egress, or whether you are just kind of in the beginning phases and you want to have a preparedness plan. So you might start with a Ready, Set, Go program so that you're able to discuss and message and educate your community on what things are necessary for evacuation. So just considering what level of knowledge and engagement your community is at, and then building programs out from that is just a really core piece of this fire adaptation work. So I you may have seen there were recovery and prevention buckets within that wheel. So I also wanted to touch a little bit on, when you do fire adaptation work. And the answer is all of the time. This is very cyclical work. One part of using that wheel is just to, emphasize that this is not, as I keep saying, it's not a linear process. It is not a checklist, but this is something, fire adaptation is really a lifelong pursuit for all of us. And so it's occurs before wildfire. Fire adaptation can look like mitigation, preparedness, planning, community engagement, and all sorts of different things. During a wildfire, it might look like evacuation, sheltering, communications, and updates. And after fire, it might look like damage assessment, insurance, flood mitigation, all sorts of things. So fire adaptation and fire adapted communities really covers a wide spectrum of activities and actions. And it's really all about doing what is going to build resilience in your community and making sure that your people and your infrastructure are as prepared as they can be for the impacts of wildfire. So I also wanted to touch on just who is involved. I keep saying practitioners and community members and this and that, but I do want to highlight just the really wide spectrum of people that are involved in wildfire adaptation work and in building fire adapted communities. So similar to FEMA and their whole community approach, fire adapted communities really have a role for everyone in the community. If you've been around these concepts before, you may have heard the phrase that everyone has a role. And that's something that's really true and I think really incredibly important to emphasize. So I'm going to move on after this to just a couple of examples of the different types of people and organizations that we have in our network that are working on fire adaptation, so you can see a bit more concretely the different types of actions and the very different types of communities that are working on fire adaptation. But before that, I just really want to emphasize and hope you'll leave with the message that anyone can work on fire adaptation, and it's really critical that it is the whole community that is working on fire adaptation. You don't have to be an agency representative, you don't have to even be a community leader or a member of FACNet. It isn't about being an official or having a certain type of job, but really adapting our communities to wildfire requires everybody to take action. This is a cultural shift to think about what our relationship to fire is and to recognize that it is a constant. It is something that we invite to our dinner table every day if we're cooking. We do have this responsibility to fire and this relationship to it that is different from a lot of the other hazards that we face in our lives. And that's something that we have not necessarily been invited to participate in a relationship with fire before. I know I was not invited to do so growing up. I never thought of this as something that I would think about or even say the words, have a relationship with fire. But there is just the real fact, especially, for those of us living in more rural areas or in fire-prone areas. So many of us live in fire-adapted ecosystems, and it is a requirement for us to think about how we live with fire and live well with fire and support all of our communities in living well with fire. The other side of this is just that fire departments and government agencies can't do all the work on their own. I'm sure if you've heard anything about the wildfire crisis or any of these kind of doom and gloom terms, or lack of workforce and lack of capacity, it is really important that the whole community is considered when we talk about fire adaptation and talk about undertaking fire adaptation work and building resilience in our communities. So it is important, I think, and I would argue that we ask ourselves who is at the table and who's missing from the table when we are working on fire adaptation, and what kind of partnerships are we building, and how can we build bigger and better partnerships so that everybody is working on building fire adapted communities together. So, if you're thinking about those partnerships, if you're a practitioner and you're concerned with smoke preparedness or creating a community wildfire protection plan, which I've been hearing more and more about lately as two really important topics for people, you might want to think about partnering across this wheel. Maybe the public health officials to work on smoke preparedness with, or local tourism groups whose businesses are being negatively impacted by wildfire smoke, your Chamber of Commerce, local politicians, to really help movement on getting smoke preparedness into the community. And other folks that you can see identified in this graphic, they include everything from community members to state and local tribal government representatives, public health researchers, federal agencies, business and land managers. And I'm sure there are many other roles that we have not identified on this circle that are and should be involved in working on fire adaptation in communities. And by bringing together these different types of partnerships and encouraging really that whole community to be involved, that's how we support and get input from everybody, so that it's not just one person who's trying to shoulder the burden of wildfire adaptation on their own. And together, these partners are much stronger than they are singly. Everyone has an expertise to bring to the table, and especially in areas that you might not have thought of, or that you might not have in your organization or in your community or your neighborhood. And they can also bring up important considerations in planning and in developing priority plans that maybe you haven't considered, or that might be different from your own, but are really critical to kind of that whole community safety piece. Additionally, I'll just note another caveat. Some people and organizations may fit into more than one group here. Residents in a community might also be business leaders or Chamber of Commerce presidents. Land managers could work for state and federal forestry agencies, but they also have a place in the community too. So many of us have different hats that we wear, and that's I think, a valuable, but also a time constraint thing that we bring into fire adaptation work. And so building out those partnerships and thinking about all the different types of people that you can involve in fire adaptation work is a really critical component of success for a lot of projects. Because the reality is that people working in fire and in emergency response or disaster management have a really heavy load already. And one person, one job type, one type of organization really cannot do this work alone. Just because there are different ways for people to participate in fire adaptation, it doesn't mean that we or one single person or one single agency needs to do all of the things. And so building those partnerships is really a critical other component of fire adaptation work. All right, so I will just pause briefly to see if there are any questions or any other points that people want to raise just for a moment, and then I will get into some more actual examples of communities. Yeah. Robin. I don't know if you can unmute or if I.
Can you unmute yourself, Robin?
There we
There you
go. Sorry. I just wanted to bring up that, it's not unusual that I would be saying something like this because Tiernan and I have worked together for years, but volunteer groups is really not a part of that wheel. I don't see that as a part of the wheel, but what we're finding in Colorado is that the volunteer groups can be a part of that whole community in doing mitigation work. And a couple of the volunteer groups that are active in disasters, post recovery or prevention even, are focusing now on mitigation as a skill that they have. So I think that's something that could be added to your graphic.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Robin. Yeah, the Team Rubicon immediately comes to mind when you say that. I really appreciate the input. All right, so I wanted to now move to just a couple of examples from across the country. I tried to select a variety of both East and West people to talk about. So I'll just go through a little bit. Each of these people has some different priorities that they've been working on in their community, and I chose them so that just you'd get even more of a flavor of the wide variety of activities that go into fire adaptation and kind of the different emphasis that is placed on different activities in different types of landscapes, different communities, geographies, and social environments. So I'm going to start off with Ashland, Oregon. So you may be familiar with them. They're located in Southern Oregon, and they have a very famous Shakespeare festival. But if you are a wildfire aficionado, it's probably more likely that you know them for their partnerships. They've been working on wildfire preparedness and forest resilience for decades, but they also have this incredibly robust smoke preparedness program. That's a great way to highlight the diversity of partnerships that they have built and that continues to really, that they use to expand their program in some really interesting ways. So I wanted to just touch on this SmokeWise program that Ashland formed in 2016 to help their communities better prepare for wildfire smoke. It is a really incredibly pervasive problem there, and something that has really negatively impacted their tourism and their communities at large. And so they identified this as a really critical problem to be working on, and their solution was to build out these partnerships around that. So this is just a couple of their partnerships. They have an entire website devoted to their SmokeWise program where you can find a lot of different information. They've developed a manual and toolkit for their business community to help their businesses really prepare better for smoke. But one of the things that is interesting here is to look at how front and center these public health practitioners are in wildfire efforts. So Asante is the community health provider there in Ashland. They've also got the Chamber of Commerce represented as a very strong partner, as well as the Shakespeare Festival that I mentioned. And they're fire rescue folks taking the lead there, but really working with these other really important partnerships to make sure that they are reaching across the community to address this cross-cutting problem of smoke that they've had for so long. And so this hasn't in the past necessarily been a traditional roster of partners that folks have looked at. but thinking about how to tackle the problem in a way that works best for their community, for their place, and for their community members has been really critical to their work and has been really successful. So this example just shows how effective partnerships can be when they extend outside of that traditional reach. And we're recognizing that fire adaptation is not something that belongs, again, to one agency, to one type of job or one official, but it's really something that does cut across that whole community. And so they continue to build this SmokeWise program out. They are, they now have specific grants dedicated to this program. They are putting filters in schools so that children can continue learning during smoke events. They're doing some, research on doing some air quality monitoring directly in the schools to ensure that children are not suffering adverse impacts while they're learning. They've done an incredible job kind of building a strategy and metrics and evaluation around outreach to vulnerable populations in their community to make sure that those that have pre-existing health conditions or those that are maybe less able to cope with smoke impacts have fewer health complications during the fire season. And they've been working a lot with some of the migrant populations to ensure that their whole community is supported and recognized and has resources to deal with smoke impacts. And because of this outreach and their continued outreach, they've really gotten, a great response of the community trusting these different agencies and being willing to come forward and identify if they do need assistance. And so there's this building effect. Their SmokeWise program has been around for a long time, but building these programs out and these partnerships has made for a really successful program that continues to grow and expand in some new ways that they hadn't anticipated when they first began the program. So next I wanted to just touch on Ely, Minnesota, which has been using their fire adaptation work in some really great community building ways to bridge across gaps that existed, some lack of trust between agencies and community members. They had some pretty bad fallout from fires in the past where people were kind of no longer looking at agency partners with as much trust as they were before. There were some hard feelings there, but this work that our members have undertaken in the community has been just really unifying for these kind of different groups. So the indigenous tribes in the area have been doing a lot of work with academic partners as well as with community partners to bring cultural burning back to the landscape and to start to restore some of those critical lifeways that had been lost to the tribes. And some of the fire adaptation work in this area has really been about elevating the stories that are taking place. So there was a video made about some of these tribal practices, and they've hosted movie nights for people, and having it might sound a little surprising, but just being able to tell those stories to the community has really been healing and allowed people to think about what their place in fire adaptation is and how they can work together in different ways than they have done in the past. And so another part of this has been offering skill building sessions to community members. So there's been a lot of chainsaw classes and working on training people to do home assessments. So this has been a way to empower landowners in this rural area to take charge of their landscape mitigation and also to increase trust in the Forest Service and other land owning agencies due to this increase in communication and connection and storytelling. And also having this kind of narrative forum has allowed non-Indigenous communities to better understand the importance of cultural fire. I also wanted to touch on just this other Eastern example and the relationships that have been so critical to really increasing the reach of prescribed fire and just a lot of a lot of fire and building safety zones around communities in the WUI in New Jersey. So you might be able to see the fire scars on some of these trees. This is an area that has seen a lot of prescribed fire in the Pine Barrens. The owner of this land is actually a cranberry farmer, and so he burns regularly on his land to restore forest health and to make sure that his cranberries are successful in their space. But just what has enabled this success is a lot of planning and, again, in a lot of partnerships. So this is a picture of a researcher talking to a group of fire adaptation practitioners about carbon capture in this forest and how prescribed burning was one way that they have restored a stand of well, it's not just a stand of trees, but this forest that was really severely damaged by insects. And so they are now, monitoring the carbon capture of these forests and are able to see that through prescribed fire, they're now capturing as much carbon as they were before the insect infestation. And so getting all of these community members to understand the importance of prescribed burning and then be able to implement it, and then to have these researchers come in and learn new things about the impact of prescribed fire in these forests has been incredibly important for this area and for understanding future restoration or future burn regimens for these forests. And so there are a number of great partnerships in this New Jersey project, but I did just want to emphasize some of the outcomes here that strategic planning has really increased the number and quantity of this firework in the state, and the partnerships between local agencies has increased local community safety and helped community members understand their risks a lot better. And so when we were out at this site, we also saw this 200-foot wide fire break that the agencies had created through prescribed burning. And the reason that they were able to do that it was in the WUI, it was very close to homes, but they were able to do this because they had done effective outreach and established this trust with communities and this strong partnership that they had between local foresters and local agencies, as well as state agencies, made for a very unified message around the importance of this prescribed fire and the increase and commitment to safety of these communities. So I'll just buzz through this last example of Washington State. I wanted to highlight this because they have their own fire adaptation network across the state. There are a couple statewide fire adapted communities networks, and Washington is one of them. And what they have really focused on is building resources for all of their communities that are effective throughout the fire cycle. And so they've worked very hard to ensure that practitioners across the state have access to resources that will help them build fire adaptation in their communities before, during, and after fires. And so they've worked a lot on translating a lot of their communications and resources into Spanish because they identified that as a very great need within their communities. And they have just continued to be very responsive to the needs of different types of communities within Washington and to deliver tools and resources that will help communities get what they need and to increase their fire adaptation in their places. So as I mentioned, they have a wealth of resources that are available to address problems and projects throughout that fire cycle. The network has developed specific outreach tools to work with vulnerable and underserved populations. And because they are a statewide network, I do want to emphasize that these fire adaptation practitioners are still working locally. The fire adaptation is locally managed, projects are local, but practitioners can, through the statewide network, access knowledge, resources, and information from other practitioners within the state so that they can share information about what's happening in Washington and what they need and are seeing, and how to share information and resources as well as possible to make sure that all of these local needs are met. Oh, that wasn't the last example. I apologize. I had one more hidden in here. I did just want to touch briefly on this Placer County project, which is really great. It's run by the Placer County Resource Conservation District. This is in the Sierra Nevada in California. And it's been a very exciting program to see develop. This is focused on small scale burning on private property, and through a partnership between the County Resource Conservation District, CAL FIRE, and their local Fire Safe Council, as well as individual landowners, they are training and delivering prescribed fire and small private parcels. So private landowners are trained to do prescribed burning. Their parcels are usually 10 acres or less. They're trained through that collaboration between the Resource Conservation District and CAL FIRE. They can borrow or obtain tools and equipment through their local Fire Safe Council. And then in kind of as an expansion of this program, local landowners are then doing their own outreach to neighbors to share successful results out through the community, and also to help reduce that concern about prescribed fire and about fire by talking to their neighbors and letting them, helping them do a kind of a local risk assessment to talk about what does it mean to have a wildfire come through here versus a low intensity, slow and low burn. So there are just some exciting examples around the network of people developing small and large scale programs, working through these partnerships, and really, there are common projects and common programs throughout our network. And there are other people outside of the network, of course, doing amazing fire adaptation work as well. But it is really that kind of customization to local place and local needs, whether that's through specific partnerships, whether that's through funding streams, or whether it's even through messaging and identifying what's going to resonate most with your community, that we see just these really great success stories. So it's about, again, taking those ideas, the programs, and customizing them to your community's needs, and making sure that whoever's leading the charge, whoever is building these programs out, feels empowered to do so, and feels empowered to create the partnerships that they need to make these projects successful. So I will just sum up here since I usually have a little small group time with folks where they can think about what they're working on in their place and what they're working on through the wheel. But I know that we're about out of time, so I just will leave you with a couple of resources here. If you are interested in more fire adaptation work, or want to know more about the different types of projects that are going on around the country, I would really encourage you to check out the FACNet blog. It is, we're not selling anything. This is just stories of practitioners and what they're doing, and success stories from around our network and from our partners. And so it is a great way to kind of understand current practices, current projects in fire adaptation work, and just to get some great information about what people are doing and where and how they might be taking fire adaptation work from ideas to implementation. And so in addition to these resources, I think I'll just kind of close my talking at you with a hope that you will take away this message that fire adaptation work is for everyone. It is something that is really critical to have the whole community involved in. It, again, is not come down to one type of organization and one type of person, but it's really on all of us to, again, think about and understand how we fit into and build relationship with fire so that it is not just something to fear and try to keep away, because unfortunately that will never be entirely successful. But it's, you know, thinking about what our good relationship is to good fire and how we understand ourselves in this constant engagement and relationship to something that is will never go away. And so I hope that you know, if you have any questions about fire adaptation or need a cheerleader or any further resources, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'm happy to chat with anyone. And yeah, please check out the FACnet website for more information, those other success stories. And I will look forward to hearing more about your work in fire and how you are enthusiastic and passionate about working on fire adaptation, building partnerships, and building that good relationship to fire.
Thank you for sharing all of that information and the wonderful perspectives. I think those success stories are really good for us to see and just realize there are so many different ways that we can approach this. And so we do have some questions coming in the chat box. Will you make the slide and the resources available? Will I be able to share that with the participants?
Absolutely, yeah, I'm happy to share the slides.
Perfect. Okay, I'm gonna hurry and read through this next question. So he is asking what WUI is. So Wildland-Urban Interface, do you want to maybe explain on that? So we have discussed it in the past 3 webinars, but would you mind sharing a definition of that?
I don't have a specific fire adapted definition of WUI. I am so sorry. But I appreciate the call out. I did use that acronym when I claimed I was only going to use FAC as my acronym. But the Wildland-Urban Interface is where homes and and trees meet, basically. It was really interesting to be in New Jersey and to see their what they call the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, which was very different for me. So they have actually basically large suburbs of homes that are entirely surrounded by trees. And so they actually are within these large subdivisions are actually WUI properties, they're Wildland Urban Interface properties. And I'm used to seeing single homes, you know, in Colorado, where I am based, we usually see like single homes back in the trees, long driveways, bit of a drive to get there. But you can have kind of a wide variety of Wildland Urban Interface situations, but it's really this combination of homes and the fuels around them where they are intersecting. And we have a very provocative blog post about the WUI and discussing it in much greater depth that I will make sure to put on these slides so that Taylor can share out with you, because there are some different definitions and different ways of thinking about the wildland-urban interface.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for the question, Johnny. It is a very, very common one. WUI, like she said, there's so many different definitions. There's a lot of different classifications, and it just kind of varies by area. You can live next to the WUI in town just by having an unmanaged field next to your home, or you can have just a single cabin up on the mountain where none of that vegetation surrounding the home is maintained. It's just that native vegetation. So thank you for the question. That was a good one. It's a very common one as well. I mentioned early on, so I'm a WUI, a Wildland Urban Interface coordinator or a specialist, and with Forestry, Fire, and State Lands, we do have local WUI specialists across the state, and they are readily available to all of you guys to share information and come out and help you guys to figure out what your wildfire risk is and look into what can be done. I will say, so the slide before this one, where you have people kind of evaluate where their needs might be, I actually think that's a great thing for us to think about right now. So it's a lot of information, but maybe just after this call, think about exactly what she has right there. What are we doing well and what we could maybe improve on? And I don't know if anybody wants to jump on, they can. This is a great opportunity to talk to Teirnan about it. You can share some of your thoughts if you want. So if anybody would like to, you can raise your hand. Oh, we've got a comment. So NWCG definition is the line, area, or zone where structures and other human development meet or intermingle with undeveloped wildland or vegetation fuels. And that is a definition of the wildland urban interface. Thank you for sharing that, Mike. Robin, go ahead. You are muted. Maybe she doesn't mean to have her hand up. Are there any other questions? We have a few minutes left.
Yeah, this is Jason. I'll ask one. That you mentioned that Native American tribe and doing prescribed fire and the video they made. Is there any way we could get a copy of that video?
Yes, it is on. It's on YouTube actually, and it's available to anyone. So I will make sure that Taylor has that link to send out as well. It's a great video.
Thank you. That'd be helpful.
Yeah, my pleasure.
I might ask a question. Okay, another comment from Robin. National Wildland Fire Coordinating Group. So that's what NWCG, I guess I should have clarified that acronym as well. Thank you, Robin. Would you mind maybe expanding on the Neighborhood Ambassador Program and what steps we can take to get that implemented in our communities?
Sure. So the Neighborhood Ambassador Program is another flexible program that was developed actually by some groups in Southwest Colorado, and they have been very successful with their Neighborhood Ambassador Program. Basically, they have a group of volunteers that they have trained to go out and talk to their communities. So the training involves learning about home assessments and how to talk to people about FireWise and how to engage with their community members to make them more aware of wildfire risk and wildfire mitigation opportunities. And so they have developed a toolkit on how to build out your own neighborhood ambassador program. There's a booklet that you get, and they also have kind of regular calls that you can participate in if you do the training with them, to continue to discuss how you're building out your own neighborhood ambassador program and how to make it the most effective for your area. And so people have modified this neighborhood ambassador program to kind of focus on the topics that are of most interest to their communities. So at the core of it is really, training and then deploying volunteers within the community. And what those volunteers are doing can vary from place to place. So you might have a full volunteer home assessment program where you train your volunteers to actually assess the risk of and what the fuel loads are around homes, and try to and also to identify different interventions that could be made for home hardening programs, or it might be a neighborhood ambassador program for bringing people together to talk about ingress and egress, and how to make those safer. Or it might be, again, just looking at that Firewise program and thinking about how different neighborhoods could participate in the Firewise program. So the neighborhood ambassadors, their topics and their talking points and their trainings might look a little different from place to place, but the kind of training that the Wildfire Adapted Partnership does to help you create a neighborhood ambassador program is really focused on kind of the elements of success, like how do you start up and maintain a good volunteer program, and then how do you plan for succession? So as your volunteers kind of come in and out of the community, how do you make sure that you have a continuous pool of volunteers to draw on? And I apologize, my dog is losing his mind. I'm just gonna let him out. I will be right back. I can still hear you.
No worries. I totally understand. Thank you for that answer. At this time, I'm willing to open the question or the chat box up to questions if anybody has questions about any of the 4 webinars we have been doing, feel free to ask now. We've shared a lot of information over the past several weeks. As in Tiernan's first couple of slides, she introduced the National Cohesive Strategy, which all 4 of our webinars has covered, as well as some of that structural vulnerability, the home ignition zone, creation of defensible space. So we have covered a lot of information, and if you have questions on any of that, feel free to ask right now. And I will be compiling all of the resources, the slides, everything that we have shared with you over the past several weeks, and I will get that out to everybody as soon as possible.
Hey, this is Jason again. I just want to say thank you, Taylor. I'm Taylor's supervisor, and I've been so impressed with what she's put together with this program. She has taught me a lot, and I really appreciate it, and good job.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. And at this time, I just have to give a big thank you to Teirnan and all of the guest speakers that we've had. They have been phenomenal, and they have shared wonderful information with everybody. So it's been a great opportunity, and I am grateful for all of you who have been participating. And I will also mention, if you would share this information with your community members, just share the YouTube links. This is a great way to introduce this information to your communities, and I hope you will be able to use these tools for years to come. We've got a few minutes left if anybody has any questions. Maybe I'll throw one out there for you. So I love the map you showed in the beginning. So across the whole United States, we've got just all of these states participating in fire adapted communities. What's one of the more common challenges that you have seen and maybe a solution to facing that and overcoming it?
That's a great question, and I'm trying to think of more of a novel challenge. I think there are so many common challenges. One of the really common ones is organizational infrastructure and being able to adapt and be flexible to the requirements of funders, and everyone is so grant based that it can be difficult to get work done on a consistent basis. And so I think there are some, very common structural things that we see across the country in terms of workforce development needs and consistent funding streams for the workforce. But I think one of the other common challenges is sustained community engagement and understanding where to reach out and to maximize your efforts and your messaging with the community members around you. That is just a constant thread, I think, that really runs throughout this whole FAC framework, is just the need to engage with a wide variety of partners and to do really long-term sustained community engagement work. I think that the community engagement piece is really solved a lot of times through partnerships and having partners identify kind of different lanes that they're working in, and making sure that at least one of those partners is focused on community engagement and doing outreach. And it can really result in some tremendous impacts. So one of the recent projects that took place in Boulder County, Colorado, that has been really successful in terms of wildfire mitigation was actually a group of watershed-focused organizations, and they were looking at watershed health and increasing watershed health. And one of the ways that they wanted to do that was to reduce the impacts of burns. And so, and of course, debris going into the waterways and the post-fire flood possibility and threat. And so they really dedicated a lot of time to community outreach. And so one of the partners within that collaboration did just an incredible amount of trust building with the community and worked really hard to do a lot of face-to-face meetings with people. So it resulted in this really incredible kind of private land effort to reduce fuels and do a lot of fuel mitigation around private homes in areas where, this is a mountain town. It's not really welcoming of outside authorities. And so to have this really important community engagement piece and to have an organization that was just laser focused on that really made a huge difference in the project outcomes. And so they've been able to do mitigation in areas that they weren't sure they would ever reach because of that. So that community engagement piece is something I hear a lot. It is challenging, but building that trust and those partnerships and making sure that you have dedicated resources for doing that is really a critical piece of this work. Yeah, and I see your comment, Robin, about doing contiguous mitigation so that you are kind of maximizing that effort and making sure that it's not piecemeal. That is really critical. And that is another common challenge that I see a lot, is actually project prioritization and trying to think about, because there are so many things to do, and every kind of agency and organization is under so much pressure to get projects done as quickly as possible. It's not always the case that people are thinking about the full kind of impact of their projects across the fire cycle. So they're not thinking about how, what's going to happen with the slash piles during in post fire, like where are you putting your slash so that it is doing not bad things during an actual fire, and then the post fire impacts from that slash pile are not kind of increasing the impacts of the burn itself. And so getting rid of that biomass can be a challenge, but again, thinking through that community partnerships and engagement can be a way to kind of get at some of that, some of those hard to reach problems, those wicked problems. I was just listening to this great presentation on this Wood for Life program, where the forests in Arizona are taking their excess biomass and they're able to redistribute it to partners on reservations. And because there was an energy crisis that was created when the coal plant on near the Navajo reservation shut down, so they had no heating for their homes. And so now, the forest had this excess biomass, so they were able to, through building these really intentional tribal relationships and making sure that the tribal needs were leading this project, they were able to repurpose and reuse that biomass in a way that is helping communities and community members, rather than having it kind of create this bottleneck and decrease the ability of that forest region to get other projects done. So this all takes work. It all takes partnerships. It's not fast work, but there are these very thorny problems, that capacity, that workforce development, that biomass utilization, that are really common. But by thinking about them through this fire adaptation lens, you can get to some really interesting, powerful, and long-term solutions that may not be perfect on their first iteration, but can kind of gather steam, gather partnerships, and really snowball impacts.
Thank you for that. I love the comments and the discussion. Very good points. It's important to try to make sure it is continuous. Those efforts are not so scattered, which there is challenges on private land, having it so complex and so many different owners. And so the partnerships are crucial to making an effective project to reach goals. So that is a great point. Thank you for all of that. The mapping to help maximize coordinating projects, that is a very useful tool as well. Well, we are about out of time, so I don't want to keep you guys any longer. I want to thank Teirnan for sharing all of her knowledge with us, and thank all of you guys for participating in these webinars. We will be sharing the information with you, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Feel free to reach out if you have questions as well. Have a good night, everyone.